Hey y'all, welcome to our new series where we are going to answer the question, am I called to teach the Bible? Now, I'm going to be honest, this was originally going to be a 4-part series where I was going to share 4 signs that you are called to teach, and I'm still planning on doing that for the next 4 videos. But when I began my research, I realized that this topic was way more complex than I had originally thought. So I'm adding on this first video, making it a 5-part series in which I'm going to share 3 complexities and 2 biblical principles to guide the rest of this conversation. So let's jump in. Here's the first complexity. When I started researching in the New Testament how God actually uses the word called, He never uses it to discuss how He calls someone to a certain ministry or to use a certain gift, which is the way us Christians in the church usually use that term. No, instead, the way that God uses the word called in the New Testament is always a calling to salvation. For example, in Romans 8, God says, those who He predestined, He called, and those who He called, He justified. Or in 1 Corinthians 1, Paul says, brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called, talking about the call to salvation. Or in 2 Timothy 1, He has saved us and called us to a holy life. So that is the first complexity, is that we Christians usually walk around talking about a calling to a certain ministry, but the most overt calling in the New Testament is not to a specific ministry, something we do for God. The calling that we, all Christians, have is a call to salvation, and that is a holy life. That is salvation. Okay, so if you're tracking with me, then no one has a unique calling, at least in the way that the New Testament uses that word, to a certain ministry. So that begs the question. Maybe we don't have a calling to a certain ministry, but don't some people have a unique command to a certain ministry of teaching? And that actually lets us hit the second complexity of this conversation, which is the inclusive command, not just for some uniquely gifted people to teach, but for all Christians to teach the word. For example, we see that in James 5, all Christians carry the burden of going to one another and restoring one another if someone falls into sin. Or Ephesians 4 says that all Christians should be speaking the truth. That means teaching one another, speaking the truth in love in order to help one another grow in the faith. We also see in Hebrews 3 that we are called to exhort one another daily. And then we see this uniquely for women in Titus 2, that the older women, and that means many of the older women, are called to teach what is good and thereby train the younger women. So this is actually the second complexity, is that it's hard to say that there's this unique elite group of teachers that are set aside in the church in the same way that we usually say that, in light of the fact that biblically speaking, everyone has a certain burden or command to be teaching the word and speaking truth to one another in love. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, yes, I know we're all called to teach in a way, but isn't there a unique group of people who should really be set apart to teach the word? And that brings us to our third complexity, which is this. Specifically, when it comes to those who are appointed by God to teach, mainly the pastors, the way the scripture talks about it is much less that they have a gift of teaching, and much more along the lines of they themselves, the pastors, are the gift of teaching. Let me read it to you in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11. It says, and God gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, and the shepherd teachers to equip the saints. So the way scripture discusses this is not so much along the lines of the idea that a unique individual has the gift of teaching, but more so along the lines of anyone who is gifted to teach, that they themselves are the gift to the church. And I was just discussing this with a friend of mine. Think about the implication here. If you have the gift of teaching, maybe you're gifted or you're skilled in teaching, that the gift to the church is not so much your skill or your talent. It's you, yourself. You, the teacher, are the gift to the church, which means we must identify who is skilled at teaching and recognize that they themselves are a gift to the church, and we must equip them in order to teach the church. So those are the different complexities of this conversations. Now I want to pivot and I want us to discuss the two principles that are going to guide the rest of this conversation. The first principle is that some people do have the gift of teaching. And yes, it's true that on the one hand, the teacher himself or herself is the gift to the church. But on the other hand, the talent or the skill, the ability to be able to explain things, to teach, is in itself a gift. And we know that because we see that language used in Romans chapter 12, verse 6. Paul says, having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. If prophecy, in proportion to our faith. If service, and our serving. And to the one who teaches, in his teaching. So there you have it. The Apostle Paul says that many of us have gifts, and then he lists teaching as a gift from the Spirit for the edification of the church. And here's the second principle, that if you have the gift of teaching, you must use it. We also see that here in Romans chapter 12, verse 6. Paul says, having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. So sisters, hopefully for the next 4 videos, as we discuss these 4 signs of whether or not you're called to teach, I want us to remember the primary thrust of the New Testament says that your number one calling is not to a ministry or a mission, but it is to Jesus Christ. Our number one call is to follow Jesus. We need to remember that all of us, in a way, are called to teach truth. And then we also need to remember that we ourselves, the teachers, we are the gift to the church. But in addition to that, our skill and our talent to be able to explain things in a way that help people to understand Scripture is also a gift to the church. So therefore, you need to use that gift. So in the next 4 videos, we are going to discuss how to know if you have that gift, if you're ready to use that gift. And then we're also going to discuss some of the practical implications. So I'm looking forward to discussing that with you. And until next time, women, teach the word.